Prince Alexander stood at the towering windows of Raven's Hollow Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the ancient gardens. At 35, he carried the weight of tradition on his shoulders, yet his mind was troubled by whispers that had been circulating through the royal corridors for weeks. As the heir to the throne of Eldoria, he had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, but nothing had prepared him for the storm brewing within his own family. The trouble had begun 3 months ago, when his father, King Edmund, had remarried. Lady Victoria Ashford, a woman of striking beauty and sharp intelligence, had captured the aging monarch's heart with remarkable speed. Their whirlwind romance had shocked the kingdom, coming just 2 years after Queen Isabella's tragic death in a riding accident. Many had whispered that it was too soon, too convenient. But Alexander had tried to support his father's happiness, even if his own heart remained heavy with grief for his beloved mother. Victoria had entered their lives like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each note perfectly timed to create the desired effect. She possessed an uncanny ability to be exactly what King Edmund needed at any given moment. Sometimes the grieving widow who understood loss, other times the vibrant companion who brought laughter back to the palace halls. Her background was impeccable on paper, daughter of a respected nobleman, educated at the finest institutions, with connections throughout the European aristocracy. Yet something about her felt rehearsed, as if she were playing a role rather than living her truth. The first sign of trouble came during a state dinner with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Alexander had noticed Victoria's eyes following certain guests with an intensity that seemed out of place for casual social observation. She asked pointed questions about trade routes, military alliances, and the kingdom's financial reserves. Information that, while not strictly classified, seemed oddly specific for someone whose role should have been largely ceremonial. When Alexander mentioned his observations to his younger sister, Princess Margaret, she had laughed it off as his natural suspicion of anyone trying to replace their mother. But Alexander's unease had only grown stronger. He began paying closer attention to Victoria's daily activities, her correspondence, and her late-night movements through the palace. The royal residence was vast, with numerous wings and hidden passages that dated back centuries. Staff members had mentioned seeing the new queen wandering the halls at unusual hours, always with a perfectly reasonable explanation when questioned. She claimed to suffer from insomnia, a condition that made her seek solitude in the palace's quieter quarters. The breaking point came on a storm-lashed Tuesday evening in late October. Alexander had been working late in his private study, reviewing agricultural reports from the kingdom's outer provinces, when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The sound was distinctive, the soft click of expensive heels moving with purpose, rather than the hurried pace of a servant or the casual stroll of a sleepless wanderer. Something about the rhythm made him set down his papers and move to his door. Through the slightly open doorway, he watched Victoria's silhouette move down the dimly lit hallway toward the east wing of the palace. This section housed the royal archives, historical documents, and more importantly, his father's private office where matters of state were conducted. Alexander's pulse quickened as he realized that Victoria was heading directly toward areas that should have been off-limits to anyone without explicit royal business. He followed at a distance, using the shadows and his intimate knowledge of the palace layout to remain undetected. Victoria moved with the confidence of someone who had planned this route carefully, never hesitating at intersections or pausing to orient herself. She carried a small leather portfolio and what appeared to be a set of keys that Alexander didn't remember his father giving her. The East Wing was protected by additional security measures, including Guard Captain Marcus Thornfield's elite unit. These men were handpicked for their loyalty and discretion, sworn to protect not just the royal family's safety but also their secrets. As Alexander watched from behind a marble pillar, he saw Victoria approach the entrance to his father's private offices. To his amazement, she produced a key that opened the door without any resistance. Guard Captain Thornfield appeared moments later, his expression one of controlled alarm. He had been making his routine patrol when he spotted the unauthorized entry. The captain was a man of few words but decisive action, a veteran of multiple conflicts who had saved the royal family from 3 assassination attempts over his 15-year tenure. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but his allegiance was to the institution and its rightful protector, not necessarily to every individual who wore a crown or bore a title. "Your Majesty," Thornfield said quietly but firmly as he stepped into the doorway behind Victoria. These offices are restricted during evening hours without the king's explicit permission. Victoria turned with a grace that spoke of extensive training in deportment and crisis management. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating as she assessed the situation. "Oh, Captain Thornfield, how dedicated you are to your duties. I was simply retrieving some correspondence that my husband asked me to review. You know how he worries about keeping me informed of royal responsibilities." The explanation was smooth, delivered with just the right mixture of authority and charm. But Alexander noticed something that chilled him. Victoria's hand had moved instinctively to close the portfolio she carried, and her body language suggested she was prepared for confrontation rather than surprised by interruption. Captain Thornfield's response was measured but unmistakably firm. "I would be happy to escort you to retrieve any materials tomorrow morning when proper protocols can be followed, Your Majesty. For tonight, I must ask you to accompany me back to the main residence." The tension in the air was palpable. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath her cultivated exterior. "Captain, I hope you're not suggesting that I, as Queen, need permission to access my own family's documents. I'm suggesting that security protocols exist for everyone's protection, including yours, Your Majesty. The king himself follows these procedures." Alexander watched this exchange from his hiding place, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. His stepmother was accessing restricted documents without authorization, in the middle of the night, with keys she shouldn't possess. The portfolio she carried suggested she was removing materials rather than simply reviewing them. Most disturbing of all was her reaction to being caught, not embarrassment or apology, but calculated defiance. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Victoria attempting various combinations of charm, authority, and subtle threats to convince Thornfield to allow her to continue. But the captain remained unmoved, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on his sword hilt. Finally, Victoria conceded with apparent grace, agreeing to return to her chambers and address the matter with King Edmund in the morning. As they walked back through the corridors, Alexander remained hidden but followed at a distance. He noticed that Victoria's demeanor changed completely once she thought she was unobserved. Gone was the regal bearing and warm smile, replaced by tense shoulders and quick, calculating glances around the hallways. She was memorizing details, planning future attempts, treating the palace like a puzzle to be solved rather than a home to be cherished. When Victoria finally disappeared into the royal apartments, Captain Thornfield lingered in the hallway. Alexander emerged from his hiding place, and the two men exchanged a look of mutual understanding. No words were necessary. They both recognized that something significant had just occurred. "Your Highness," Thornfield said quietly, "I believe we need to discuss tonight's events." Alexander nodded grimly. "Tomorrow morning, Captain. We need to determine exactly what she was after and how she obtained those keys." As Alexander returned to his chambers, his mind was already working through the implications of what he had witnessed. Victoria wasn't simply a lonely stepmother wandering the palace halls. She was conducting some form of intelligence gathering, accessing documents and information that could compromise the kingdom's security. The question was whether she was working alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. As heir to the throne, he had a duty to protect not just his father, but the entire kingdom. If Victoria posed a threat to Eldoria's security, he would need to act decisively, regardless of his father's feelings, or the potential scandal that would engulf the royal family. Sleep eluded him that night as he stared at the ceiling, planning his next moves. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and harder decisions. The man who had always tried to see the best in people would need to prepare for the possibility that his stepmother was not who she claimed to be. The peaceful kingdom of Eldoria might be harboring an enemy within its most sacred walls, and Prince Alexander was the only one who stood between his family and potential disaster. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Prince Alexander made his way to Captain Thornfield's private office. He had barely slept, his mind churning through the events of the previous night and their possible meanings. The captain was already waiting, having clearly spent an equally restless night contemplating the same troubling questions. Thornfield's office was a study in military precision. Maps of the kingdom adorned the walls, Detailed security protocols lay organized on his desk, and a locked cabinet contained sensitive intelligence reports. The captain poured 2 cups of strong coffee as Alexander settled into the chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing the security logs," Thornfield began without preamble. "This wasn't the first time Queen Victoria has accessed restricted areas. My men have reported unusual activity on at least 6 previous occasions over the past 2 months. Each incident was explained away with reasonable excuses, and frankly, we were reluctant to challenge the Queen's movements too aggressively." Alexander set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. 6 times? Why wasn't I informed? Because until last night there was no clear evidence of wrongdoing. A new queen exploring her residence, even restricted areas, could be attributed to curiosity or insomnia. But the possession of unauthorized keys and the systematic nature of her activities suggest something far more calculated. The captain opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across his desk. "I took the liberty of conducting a discreet investigation into Her Majesty's background. What I discovered is concerning." Alexander leaned forward, studying the papers. They contained detailed reports on Victoria's life before her marriage to King Edmund, information that went far beyond the polished biography that had been presented to the royal family and the public. "Lady Victoria Ashford," Thornfield continued, "is indeed the daughter of Earl Ashford as claimed. However, her education and travels were far more extensive than initially reported. She spent 3 years in Valenhall, the neighboring kingdom with which we've had increasing tensions over trade disputes and border rights. During that time, she was closely associated with Count Draven Blackthorne, a man known to be one of Valenhall's most skilled intelligence operatives. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Valenhall had been pressing for access to Eldoria's strategic mountain passes, routes that would give them significant advantages in both trade and military positioning. The recent border skirmishes had been subtle but persistent, testing Eldoria's defenses and resolve. "There's more," Thornfield continued grimly. "The timing of her appearance in our kingdom coincides exactly with the escalation of Valenhall's diplomatic pressure. She met your father at the Autumn Harvest Festival, just 3 weeks after our ambassador to Valenhall was expelled for allegedly spying on their military installations."
Alexander studied a detailed timeline that Thornfield had prepared.
The pattern was undeniable once laid out clearly. Victoria's courtship of King Edmund had been swift but perfectly calculated, each milestone in their relationship corresponding with key political developments between the 2 kingdoms. "The keys," Alexander said quietly. "How did she obtain them?" "That's perhaps the most troubling aspect," Thornfield replied. "Those keys are crafted by the royal locksmith using a unique design that's been unchanged for over a century. Only 3 sets exist, one held by the king, one by you as heir, and one kept in the secure vault below the palace. Either she has managed to duplicate one of these sets, or someone provided them to her," Alexander finished. The possibility of betrayal from within the royal household was almost too painful to contemplate. Thornfield nodded gravely. "I've ordered discreet surveillance on all palace staff with access to sensitive areas. We need to determine if Queen Victoria has accomplices within our walls." Alexander stood and moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful gardens where courtiers and servants went about their daily routines. Any one of them might be part of a conspiracy that threatened everything he held dear. The weight of suspicion felt like a poison spreading through his thoughts. "What exactly was she accessing in my father's office?" Alexander asked. "Based on the materials that appeared to have been disturbed, she was particularly interested in our military readiness reports and the detailed maps of the mountain pass fortifications. She also accessed correspondence related to our alliance treaties with neighboring kingdoms." Alexander's blood ran cold. "Those documents contained information that could allow Valenhall to plan a devastating attack on Eldoria's most vulnerable points. If Victoria was indeed a spy, she now possessed intelligence that could lead to the kingdom's defeat in any military conflict. We need to confront my father immediately," Alexander said, turning back to Thornfield. The captain's expression was pained. "Your Highness, I fear that may be more complicated than you realize. King Edmund is deeply infatuated with his new wife. This morning, I received word that he has granted Queen Victoria additional security clearances and access to even more sensitive areas of the palace. He believes he is helping her transition into her role as queen and trusted advisor. Alexander felt the world tilt around him. His father, in his grief and loneliness, had been manipulated by a woman who might be orchestrating the kingdom's destruction. The man who had once been the shrewdest political mind in the region was now blind to the dangers sleeping beside him each night. "There's something else you need to know," Thornfield continued reluctantly. "I've been monitoring Queen Victoria's private correspondence. She receives regular letters from what appears to be a cousin in Vellenhall, but the frequency in coded language suggests something far more significant than family communication." He produced several intercepted letters, their seals expertly restored after examination. The writing appeared innocent enough on the surface, discussions of weather, family news, and social events, but Alexander could see the underlying patterns that Thornfield had identified. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, and the timing of the letters corresponded with political developments in Eldoria. "The roses are blooming early this year." Alexander read aloud from one letter. "Uncle hopes the garden party can be moved to next month. We believe this refers to military movements," Thornfield explained. "Roses appears to be code for troop deployments, and garden party likely refers to a planned operation of some kind." Alexander felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Victoria wasn't simply gathering information. She was actively coordinating with enemy agents to plan some form of action against Eldoria. The woman sharing his father's bed and state secrets was quite possibly planning the kingdom's downfall. "What about confronting Victoria directly?" Alexander asked. "If we present her with this evidence, perhaps we can force her to admit her true purposes." Thornfield shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous, Your Highness. If she is indeed a trained operative, confronting her prematurely could cause her to accelerate whatever timeline she's working toward. We need to determine the full scope of her mission and identify all her accomplices before we act." The captain pulled out a detailed map of the palace and surrounding grounds. "I propose we set a trap. We allow Queen Victoria to believe she has continued access while we monitor her activities closely. Meanwhile, we prepare false information that will reveal her true intentions while protecting our real strategic assets." Alexander studied the map, noting the various entrances, passages, and secure areas that Victoria might target. The plan was risky but necessary. They needed to gather enough evidence to convince King Edmund of his wife's betrayal, evidence that would be undeniable even to a man blinded by love. "How long do we have?" Alexander asked. "Based on the patterns in her correspondence, I believe something significant is planned for the Winter Solstice Festival. That gives us approximately 6 weeks to uncover her full network and prepare our countermeasures." The Winter Solstice Festival was Eldoria's most important celebration, drawing dignitaries and visitors from across the region. It would be the perfect time for enemy agents to infiltrate the kingdom under the cover of legitimate diplomatic and cultural activities. Alexander made his decision with the weight of the crown already heavy on his shoulders. "Very well, Captain. We proceed with your plan. But I want daily reports on every aspect of Victoria's activities, and I want our most trusted agents watching every person she interacts with." "Understood, Your Highness. I'll also arrange for additional security measures around the king, though we must be careful not to alert Queen Victoria to our suspicions." As Alexander prepared to leave Thornfield's office, the captain called him back. "Your Highness, there's one more thing. I've noticed that Princess Margaret has been spending considerable time with Queen Victoria recently. They've become quite close, with Victoria often seeking her advice on royal protocols and Eldorian customs." The implication hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. His younger sister, innocent and trusting, might be unknowingly providing Victoria with additional information or access. Margaret had always been the family member most willing to see the best in others, and her grief over their mother's death had made her grateful for any maternal figure who showed her kindness. "I'll speak with Margaret," Alexander said quietly. "But carefully. We can't risk alerting Victoria to our suspicions through my sister's reactions." Alexander left the captain's office with his mind reeling from the scope of the conspiracy threatening his family and kingdom. The woman his father had married in hopes of finding happiness again was quite possibly an enemy agent working to destroy everything the royal family had sworn to protect. The next few weeks would require him to become something he had never wanted to be, a spy within his own home, watching and waiting for his stepmother to reveal her true intentions. The thought of the deception and manipulation required made him feel sick, but the alternative, allowing Eldoria to fall to enemy schemes, was unthinkable. As he walked through the palace corridors, Alexander found himself seeing everything differently. Every servant, every courtier, every smile from Victoria across the dinner table would now be viewed through the lens of suspicion and strategic analysis. The home that had once represented safety and tradition had become a battlefield where the wrong move could cost his family everything they held dear. 2 weeks had passed since Alexander and Captain Thornfield had begun their secret surveillance operation. The weight of maintaining normalcy while harboring such devastating suspicions was taking its toll on the prince. Every family dinner became a performance. Every casual conversation with Victoria a careful dance of gathering information while revealing nothing of his growing certainty about her true nature. The evidence had been mounting steadily. Hidden cameras installed by Thornfield's most trusted agents had captured Victoria making 3 additional nighttime visits to restricted areas. Each time she demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the palace's security protocols that could only have been obtained through extensive preparation or inside assistance. More disturbing still, she had been observed photographing documents with a concealed camera, technology that was far more advanced than anything commonly available in Eldoria. Alexander sat in his private study, reviewing the latest intelligence reports when Princess Margaret knocked on his door. At 28, his sister possessed their mother's gentle spirit and trusting nature, qualities that made her beloved by the kingdom's people, but potentially vulnerable to manipulation. "Alexander, may I speak with you?" Margaret asked as she entered, her expression unusually troubled. "It's about Victoria." Alexander's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. "Of course. What's concerning you?" Margaret settled into the chair across from his desk, wringing her hands nervously. "She's been asking me the strangest questions lately. At first, I thought she was simply trying to understand our family traditions and the kingdom's customs. But yesterday, she wanted to know specific details about the mountain pass defenses and our relationships with the border villages." The confession confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Victoria was using Margaret's innocent desire for sisterly companionship to extract strategic information. His sister's natural inclination to help and educate was being exploited by a woman who saw her as nothing more than a source of intelligence. "What kind of specific details?" Alexander asked carefully. She wanted to know about the guard rotation schedules, the communication systems between the border posts, and whether the villagers had any grievances against the crown that might make them unreliable in times of conflict. Margaret's voice grew smaller as she spoke, clearly beginning to understand the implications of what she was revealing. Alexander reached across the desk and took his sister's hand. "Margaret, you haven't done anything wrong, but I need you to think very carefully. Has Victoria shown particular interest in any other aspects of our kingdom's defenses or political relationships?" Tears began to form in Margaret's eyes as the full scope of her inadvertent betrayal became clear. "Oh, Alexander, what have I done?" She seemed so genuinely interested in becoming a good queen. She said she wanted to understand every aspect of the kingdom so she could support father properly. "You acted out of love and trust," Alexander said gently. "But I need to know everything she asked about and everything you told her. No detail is too small." Over the next hour, Margaret provided a comprehensive account of her conversations with Victoria. The picture that emerged was of a systematic intelligence-gathering operation that had exploited the princess's knowledge and goodwill. Victoria had learned about trade agreements, military capabilities, potential internal dissent, and diplomatic relationships that took Margaret years to accumulate through her royal duties. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "I've noticed that she receives visitors late at night. I've seen lights in her private sitting room well past midnight, and I've heard muffled conversations. When I asked her about it, she said she suffers from insomnia and sometimes meets with her ladies-in-waiting to discuss the next day's activities." Alexander exchanged glances with Captain Thornfield, who had been silently listening from his position near the window. Neither of Victoria's ladies-in-waiting lived in the palace, and both were accounted for during the late-night meetings Margaret had observed. "Did you recognize any voices?" Thornfield asked. Margaret shook her head. "The conversations were too quiet, and I didn't want to appear to be eavesdropping. But there was something about the tone. It didn't sound like casual conversation between women. It sounded more like meetings. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Victoria wasn't just gathering information. She was actively coordinating with Confederates, possibly planning some form of action that would threaten the kingdom's security. The Winter Solstice Festival was now just 3 weeks away, and the urgency of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. "Margaret," Alexander said seriously, "I need you to understand that what we've discussed cannot leave this room. Your safety and the kingdom's safety may depend on Victoria believing that her activities remain undetected." The princess nodded solemnly, her earlier innocence replaced by a mature understanding of the gravity of the situation. "What do you need me to do?" "For now, continue your normal interactions with Victoria, but be extremely careful about what information you share. If she asks about anything related to the kingdom's security or political relationships, try to deflect or provide vague answers. Can you do that?" Margaret straightened her shoulders with a resolve that reminded Alexander powerfully of their late mother. "Yes, but Alexander, what about father? He's completely devoted to her. If she's really what you suspect, he's in terrible danger." The question that had been haunting Alexander for weeks hung heavy in the air. King Edmund's love for Victoria appeared genuine and deep, a bright spot in the grief that had consumed him since Queen Isabella's death. Destroying that happiness even to protect the kingdom would break something fundamental in his father's spirit. "We need absolute proof before we can approach the king," Alexander said quietly. "Evidence that even his love for Victoria cannot dismiss."
Thornfield stepped forward from his position by the window.
"Your Highness, I believe we're approaching that point. The surveillance has revealed a pattern of behavior that is undeniably that of a trained operative. The question is whether we wait for her to complete whatever mission she's planning or whether we act preemptively." Alexander stood and moved to the large map of Eldoria that dominated one wall of his study. The kingdom's strategic position made it valuable to neighboring powers, but also vulnerable to the kind of infiltration that Victoria represented. The mountain passes that provided natural defense could become invasion routes if their secrets were compromised. "What's your assessment of the immediate threat level?" Alexander asked. "Based on the increased frequency of her nighttime activities and the coded correspondence we've intercepted, I believe something significant is planned for the Winter Solstice Festival. The event provides perfect cover for infiltration by foreign agents, and the celebration's traditional chaos would mask any number of suspicious activities." Margaret spoke up suddenly. "The guest list for the festival. Victoria has been very involved in planning it. She suggested several additions from Valenhall, claiming they were important for maintaining diplomatic relationships." Alexander and Thornfield exchanged alarmed glances. If Victoria was helping to place enemy agents among the festival guests, the threat to the royal family and the kingdom's security was immediate and severe. "Do you have the revised guest list?" Thornfield asked. Margaret nodded and produced a document from her reticule. "I brought it because something about Victoria's suggestions seemed odd. These aren't the usual diplomatic representatives. They're relatively unknown figures with vague credentials." Thornfield studied the list carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Several of these names appear in our intelligence files as suspected operatives. If even half of them are enemy agents, they could effectively take control of the palace during the festival's confusion." The scope of the threat was becoming clear. Victoria wasn't just gathering intelligence, she was orchestrating what appeared to be a comprehensive infiltration operation that could result in the capture or elimination of Eldoria's royal family. The Winter Solstice Festival, meant to celebrate the kingdom's prosperity and unity, was being turned into the perfect opportunity for a coup. "We have to stop this," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Alexander felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders. For weeks he had hoped that his suspicions were wrong, that Victoria's activities had innocent explanations, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the threat to his family and kingdom was real and immediate. "Captain Thornfield," Alexander said with newfound resolve, "I want you to prepare detailed dossiers on every name on that guest list. Use whatever resources necessary. Contact our allies. Investigate their backgrounds. Determine their real purposes for attending the festival." "Understood, Your Highness." "Margaret, I need you to maintain your relationship with Victoria, but I want you to start documenting everything she says and does. Pay particular attention to any mentions of the festival or our guests." Alexander moved to his desk and began writing on official royal stationery. "I'm also going to request a private audience with the ambassadors from our allied kingdoms. If Victoria is planning what I suspect, we'll need their support to prevent a disaster." The room fell silent as the three of them contemplated the magnitude of what they were facing. A foreign operative had infiltrated the highest levels of Eldorian society, manipulated the king into marriage, and was now apparently preparing to strike at the heart of the kingdom during its most important celebration. Alexander looked at his sister and his most trusted captain, drawing strength from their loyalty and determination. "We have 3 weeks to uncover the full scope of this conspiracy and develop a plan to stop it. The survival of our kingdom may depend on our success." As Margaret and Thornfield prepared to leave, Alexander remained at his desk, staring at the map of his beloved kingdom. The peaceful realm that had known prosperity and stability for generations was under threat from an enemy who had attacked not with armies, but with deception and betrayal. The coming weeks would test everything he had learned about leadership, strategy, and the terrible burden of protecting those who depended on him. The prince, who had always preferred diplomacy to conflict, now found himself preparing for a battle that would be fought in shadows and secrets, where the wrong decision could cost not just his own life, but the freedom of everyone he had sworn to protect. The winter solstice festival was now just 1 week away, and the palace buzzed with preparation activities that provided perfect cover for Alexander's counterintelligence operation. Captain Thornfield's investigation into the suspicious guest list had revealed a web of connections that confirmed their worst fears. At least 7 of Victoria's recommended guests were confirmed or suspected foreign operatives with ties to Valenhall's intelligence services. Alexander sat in an emergency meeting with his inner circle, a group that had expanded to include Sir Robert Blackwood, the kingdom's spymaster, and Lady Catherine Fairfax, the chief of palace security. The war room they occupied was hidden deep within the palace's ancient foundations, a space known only to the most trusted members of the royal guard. "The situation is worse than we initially believed," Sir Robert reported, spreading a collection of documents across the heavy oak table. "Our contacts in Valenhall have confirmed that Queen Victoria is indeed Agent Nightshade, one of their most skilled operatives. She's been planning this infiltration for over 2 years, studying our kingdom's weaknesses and preparing for this moment." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Agent Nightshade was a legendary figure in intelligence circles, responsible for the downfall of at least 3 noble houses across the continent. The fact that such a dangerous operative had successfully seduced and married his father represented a catastrophic failure of their kingdom's security. Lady Catherine placed a detailed floor plan of the palace on the table, marked with red circles indicating potential security vulnerabilities. "We've identified 13 possible entry points that her confederates could use during the festival chaos. The traditional masquerade element means that anyone could move freely through the palace for several hours before being identified."
Princess Margaret, who had proven invaluable in gathering intelligence on Victoria's activities, leaned forward with a pale but determined expression.
"I've learned something else. Victoria has been asking detailed questions about the location of the royal treasury and the ancient crown jewels. She claimed it was for planning a special presentation during the festival, but the questions were far too specific for ceremonial purposes. The implications were staggering. Not only was Victoria planning to facilitate a coup, but she intended to steal Eldoria's most precious national treasures in the process. The crown jewels represented not just monetary value, but centuries of royal history and the very legitimacy of the throne itself. Captain Thornfield pointed to a series of photographs his surveillance team had captured. These show Victoria meeting with at least 3 unidentified individuals over the past week. The meetings occurred in various locations around the kingdom: a remote inn, an abandoned mill, and the old monastery ruins. Each meeting lasted exactly 1 hour, and in each case, documents and what appeared to be payment changed hands. Alexander studied the photographs, noting the professional nature of the meetings and the obvious precautions taken to avoid detection. These were not casual social gatherings, but operational planning sessions for what was clearly a major intelligence operation. "What's our father's current security status?" Alexander asked. "King Edmund remains completely unaware of the threat," Lady Catherine reported. He's granted Victoria even broader access to sensitive areas, believing he's helping her prepare for her role as queen during the festival. She now has nearly unrestricted movement throughout the palace and access to classified documents that could compromise our defense systems. The painful irony was overwhelming. In his desire to make Victoria feel welcomed and trusted, King Edmund had essentially given a foreign spy complete access to Eldoria's most sensitive secrets. The man's generous heart, one of his greatest qualities as a king, had become the kingdom's greatest vulnerability. Sir Robert opened a leather portfolio containing intercepted correspondence. We've managed to decode several of her communications with Valenhall. The operation is codenamed Winter's End and appears designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: eliminate or capture the royal family, seize the national treasury, and position Valenhall operatives to control the kingdom's government. Alexander felt the weight of 3 centuries of royal responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. His ancestors had successfully defended Eldoria against invasions, plagues, and political upheavals, but none had faced an enemy who had infiltrated the very heart of the monarchy through love and trust. "Do we know the specific timing of their planned action?" Alexander asked. "Based on the communication patterns, we believe they'll strike during the festival's climactic moment, the traditional midnight ceremony where the royal family presents the crown jewels to the assembled nobles and foreign dignitaries," Thornfield replied. "The ceremony requires the entire royal family to be present in a single location, making it perfect for their purposes." Princess Margaret spoke up with a trembling but resolute voice. "Alexander, we have to tell Father. Whatever the personal cost, he needs to know what Victoria really is." Alexander had been dreading this moment for weeks. The conversation would shatter his father's happiness and trust, potentially breaking the spirit of a man who had already endured tremendous loss. But the alternative, allowing the operation to proceed, would result in far worse consequences for everyone. "I've prepared a comprehensive briefing," Sir Robert said quietly. "Every piece of evidence, every intercepted communication, every suspicious activity documented with timestamps and witness accounts. The case is overwhelming and undeniable. Alexander made the decision that would change everything. Arrange a private meeting with the king for tonight. We'll present the evidence and hope that his love for Eldoria outweighs his feelings for Victoria." Lady Catherine raised a crucial concern. "Your Highness, once we inform the king, we'll need to act immediately. Victoria is too skilled to miss the signs that her cover has been blown. If she suspects exposure, she'll either flee immediately or accelerate her timeline and strike before we can prepare adequate countermeasures." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the magnitude of the operation they were about to undertake. They were preparing to expose and counter a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been years in the making, planned by some of the most dangerous people in the known world. Alexander stood and moved to a window that looked out over the festival preparations in the palace courtyard. Hundreds of workers were decorating the grounds, preparing for what should have been a celebration of Eldoria's prosperity and peace. Instead, it was becoming the backdrop for a battle that would determine the kingdom's survival. "What about our own countermeasures?" Alexander asked. "We can't simply react to their plans. We need to take the initiative." Captain Thornfield smiled grimly. "I've been working on that, Your Highness. We've identified several opportunities to turn Victoria's own plan against her. The key is to allow her to believe the operation is proceeding normally while we control the actual outcomes." He produced a detailed tactical plan that showed the palace layout with defensive positions marked. "We'll use her expected schedule against her. When she and her confederates move to their assigned positions during the midnight ceremony, we'll have them surrounded and outnumbered. The challenge will be timing our response to minimize risk to the hostages they'll inevitably take." Sir Robert added, "We've also prepared false information about the crown jewel's location and enhanced security protocols. If they proceed with the theft attempt, they'll find themselves trapped in a carefully prepared kill zone rather than escaping with Eldoria's treasures." Alexander felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. They weren't just going to survive Victoria's betrayal, they were going to turn it into a decisive victory over Valenhall's intelligence operations. "What about the other suspected operatives among the festival guests?" Princess Margaret asked. "We'll be ready for them," Lady Catherine replied. Each suspected agent will be assigned a discreet escort who will ensure they remain exactly where we want them throughout the festival. When the operation begins, they'll find themselves cut off from their escape routes and outnumbered by our forces. Alexander returned to the table and studied the comprehensive plans his team had developed. The operation required precise timing and flawless execution, but it offered the possibility of not just defending Eldoria, but striking a major blow against their enemy's intelligence capabilities. Very well, Alexander said with newfound determination.
We proceed with the plan.
Captain Thornfield, begin positioning your people according to the tactical schedule. Sir Robert, prepare the briefing materials for the king. Lady Catherine, ensure that all security protocols are ready for immediate implementation. He looked around the room at the faces of the people who had helped him uncover and prepare to counter the greatest threat Eldoria had ever faced. Princess Margaret, I know this has been incredibly difficult for you, but your courage and intelligence have been essential to protecting our kingdom. Mother would be proud of how you've served Eldoria. As the meeting concluded and his advisors prepared to implement their plans, Alexander remained in the war room for a few moments longer. In less than 24 hours, he would have to tell his father that the woman he loved was an enemy agent planning to destroy everything they held dear. The conversation would be one of the most difficult of his life, but it was the price of leadership and the burden of protecting those who depended on him. The prince, who had spent weeks learning to live with suspicion and deception, was now ready to act decisively to protect his family and kingdom. The Winter Solstice Festival would indeed be memorable, but not for the reasons anyone expected. It would be remembered as the night when Eldoria faced its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever before. The confrontation with King Edmund had been every bit as devastating as Alexander had feared. The king's face had aged years in the span of an hour, as Sir Robert methodically presented the evidence of Victoria's betrayal. Photographs, intercepted communications, witness testimonies, and documented security breaches painted an undeniable picture of systematic deception and espionage. When the briefing concluded, King Edmund had sat in stunned silence for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the evidence scattered across his private study desk. The man who had ruled Eldoria with wisdom and strength for over 2 decades looked broken and fragile as he processed the magnitude of his personal and political failure. She played me perfectly, the king had finally whispered, his voice hollow with grief and shame. Every conversation, every shared moment, every expression of love, it was all calculated manipulation. Alexander had wanted to offer comfort, but there were no words that could ease this particular pain. The woman who had brought light back into his father's life after years of mourning was revealed to be the kingdom's greatest enemy, and the betrayal cut deeper than any sword. Now, 3 days later, the Winter Solstice Festival was proceeding exactly as planned, but with a carefully orchestrated counter-operation running beneath the surface celebrations. Victoria continued her role as queen, unaware that her every move was being monitored and that her Confederates were walking into an elaborate trap. Alexander stood in the hidden observation post that Captain Thornfield's team had established, overlooking the main ballroom. Through concealed cameras and strategically placed agents, they could monitor every aspect of the evening's events while remaining invisible to their targets. Agent Nightshade is moving toward the Treasury access corridor, reported Lieutenant Harrison through his communication device. 2 unknown male subjects are maintaining discreet surveillance positions near the main staircase. The midnight ceremony was still 2 hours away, but Victoria's operation was already beginning to unfold. Her Confederates had been infiltrating their assigned positions throughout the evening, each believing they were executing a perfectly planned operation against an unsuspecting target. Princess Margaret appeared beside Alexander, wearing an elegant festival gown that concealed a vest of protective armor and a concealed communication device. She had insisted on participating directly in the counter-operation, arguing that her intimate knowledge of Victoria's behavior patterns made her indispensable to its success. She's been asking me about Father's location every few minutes, Margaret reported quietly. She's trying to confirm that he'll be available for the ceremony, but there's something different about her tonight. She seems more intense, more focused. Alexander nodded grimly. Victoria was preparing for what she believed would be the culmination of years of planning and infiltration. The prospect of achieving such a significant intelligence victory was likely affecting her professional composure. Status report on the suspected operatives, Alexander asked into his communication device. Sir Robert's voice crackled back immediately. 7 confirmed hostiles have taken positions throughout the palace. Each has an assigned shadow, and escape routes have been discreetly secured. They're moving exactly according to our predicted timeline. The beauty of their counter-operation was its simplicity. Rather than trying to prevent Victoria's plan entirely, they were allowing it to proceed while controlling every critical element. When the enemy agents moved to execute their assignments, they would find themselves trapped by superior numbers and intelligence. King Edmund appeared in the observation post, dressed in his ceremonial robes but looking haggard and older than his years. The past 3 days had been torture for him as he maintained normal interactions with Victoria while knowing the truth about her intentions. "How is she behaving toward you?" Alexander asked his father quietly. "Exactly the same as always," King Edmund replied with bitter irony. "Loving, attentive, concerned for my well-being. Her acting skills are remarkable. If I didn't know the truth, I would never suspect anything was wrong." The king's pain was evident in every word. But Alexander also detected something else, a growing anger that was replacing the initial shock and grief. King Edmund was preparing to confront the woman who had violated not just his trust. Movement in the Treasury corridor. Lieutenant Harrison's voice reported urgently. "Agent Nightshade and 2 Confederates are approaching the vault entrance. They appear to be carrying specialized equipment." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment when theory became reality, when months of investigation and planning would be tested against the skills of enemy operatives who had successfully infiltrated the highest levels of Eldorian society. "All units, maintain positions!" Captain Thornfield's voice commanded over the communication network. "Let them proceed until they've committed to the crime. We want them trapped with the evidence of their intentions." Through the surveillance monitors, Alexander watched Victoria work with professional efficiency to defeat the Treasury security systems. Her movements were precise and confident, those of someone who had studied the systems extensively and knew exactly how to overcome their defenses. "She's good," Sir Robert observed grudgingly. "If we hadn't known to watch for this, she might have succeeded." The Treasury vault door opened with an almost silent whisper of ancient mechanisms. Victoria and her 2 Confederates slipped inside, immediately moving toward the cases containing Eldoria's crown jewels and most precious artifacts. "Now," Alexander said quietly into his communication device. The counter-operation unfolded with military precision. Security teams emerged from concealed positions throughout the palace, surrounding each of the identified enemy operatives before they could react or escape. The festival's music and celebration provided perfect acoustic cover for the rapid movement of armed personnel. In the Treasury, Victoria discovered too late that the crown jewels had been replaced with convincing replicas, while the real treasures were safely secured in a secondary location. As she and her Confederates realized they had been trapped, Captain Thornfield's elite guard unit sealed the vault entrance behind them. Victoria Ashford, also known as Agent Nightshade. Thornfield's voice echoed through the Treasury's communication system. "You are under arrest for espionage, treason, and conspiracy against the Crown of Eldoria." The surveillance cameras captured Victoria's reaction, a brief flicker of surprise, followed by the cold professionalism of a trained operative who understood that her mission had failed. She made no attempt to deny her identity or purpose, instead immediately assessing her situation and looking for potential escape routes that no longer existed. Meanwhile, throughout the palace, the other enemy operatives were being systematically captured. Each had been isolated from their Confederates and overwhelmed by superior numbers before they could implement any contingency plans or signal warnings to their handlers. 7 hostiles in custody, Sir Robert reported. "No casualties on our side, and minimal disruption to the festival activities." The guests in the main ballroom remained largely unaware that a major counter-espionage operation had just concluded around them. The careful planning and discreet execution had protected not just the kingdom's security, but also its reputation and the dignity of the royal family. Alexander, King Edmund, and Princess Margaret made their way to the secure holding facility where Victoria was being detained. The woman who had called herself Queen of Eldoria sat in the interrogation room with the composure of a professional who understood the rules of the intelligence game. When King Edmund entered the room, Victoria's mask finally slipped. For a brief moment, something that might have been genuine regret, or even affection, crossed her features before being replaced by cold resignation. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, I suppose congratulations are in order. Your counterintelligence capabilities were more sophisticated than our assessment indicated. King Edmund studied the woman he had loved and trusted, searching her face for any trace of the person he thought he had known. Was any of it real? Any emotion? Any moment of genuine feeling? Victoria was silent for a long moment before answering. I am a professional, Your Majesty. My mission required me to become whatever would be most effective in achieving my objectives. But I will say this. You are a better man than my briefing suggested, and your kingdom is fortunate to have you as its king. It was the closest thing to an apology or expression of genuine sentiment that they would receive from Agent Nightshade, and King Edmund accepted it with the dignity that had always characterized his reign. The interrogations that followed revealed the full scope of Valenhall's intelligence operations against Eldoria. The information provided by Victoria and her confederates, combined with the documents seized during their arrests, allowed Sir Robert to identify and neutralize an extensive spy network that had been operating throughout the kingdom for years. In the weeks that followed the Winter Solstice Festival, Eldoria's relationship with Valenhall was fundamentally restructured. The exposure of their espionage activities gave King Edmund significant leverage in diplomatic negotiations, ultimately resulting in a treaty that was far more favorable to Eldorian interests than anyone had previously thought possible. Victoria and her confederates were eventually exchanged for Eldorian agents held by Valenhall, a transaction that both kingdoms preferred to a public trial that would expose sensitive intelligence methods and capabilities. King Edmund never remarried, but he found purpose in using his painful experience to strengthen Eldoria's security services. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him ultimately made the kingdom safer and more resilient. Prince Alexander's role in uncovering and countering the conspiracy established him as a leader capable of making difficult decisions under pressure. When he eventually inherited the throne, he brought with him hard-earned wisdom about the price of trust and the constant vigilance required to protect those who depend on royal leadership. Princess Margaret continued to serve as one of the kingdom's most effective diplomatic representatives, her experience with Victoria having taught her to balance trust with careful observation and verification. The Winter Solstice Festival became an annual reminder that freedom and security require constant vigilance, and that even the most sophisticated enemies can be defeated when good people work together with courage, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to protecting what they hold dear. Eldoria had faced its greatest test and emerged not just victorious, but stronger and wiser than ever before. The kingdom that had nearly fallen to deception and betrayal had instead proven that truth, loyalty, and careful preparation could triumph over even the most elaborate schemes of its enemies.